Young girl, searching for hope, crosses paths with a Hollywood icon who has a story to tell. This unforgettable encounter is one that will stay with you forever. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over a quiet corner of Santa Monica. Outside a modest cafe, tucked between a thrift store and a laundromat, Mel Gibson sat sipping his coffee. Sunglasses perched low on his nose, dressed in a plain navy t-shirt and jeans, he looked like just another local enjoying a moment of peace. But peace is rarely uninterrupted, especially on these bustling streets. From the shadows emerged a young girl, no older than 13, barefoot and clutching a tattered backpack. Her messy brown hair framed a face that carried too much weariness for her age. She stopped a few feet from Mel, her eyes scanning him nervously, as if weighing whether to speak. Finally, she broke the silence. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady. Mel glanced up, his brow furrowing slightly in surprise. She hesitated, fidgeting with the fraying strap of her bag. Do you know who Jesus Christ is?" The question hit like a bolt of lightning, cutting through the mundane chatter of nearby pedestrians and the distant hum of traffic. For a moment, Mel didn't respond. His hand paused midair, the cup of coffee hovering near his lips. He looked at her, really looked at her, into eyes that held both innocence and untold stories of struggle. "Why do you ask?" he said gently, setting his cup down on the table. His voice, rich and resonant, carried no judgment, only curiosity. The girl shrugged, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "People talk about him. I don't know who he is. Do you?" But before Mel could answer, something about the girl's expression stopped him. It wasn't just a casual question. It was a plea, an unspoken cry for something more. Mel leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers interlocking as he studied the girl. She looked so small standing there, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world pressed down on her tiny frame. The question wasn't random, that much he could tell. There was something behind it, something deep and raw. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice calm but deliberate. "I know him." The girl's eyes flickered with something. Hope, maybe curiosity, but she quickly masked it with a practiced indifference. She hugged her backpack tighter and tilted her head. "What's he like?" Mel paused, taken aback by the simplicity and weight of her question. He glanced around, noticing a few passers-by slowing their steps, pretending not to listen. The cafe's patio seemed to shrink as an odd tension filled the air, pulling attention toward their exchange. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "You want to sit?" The girl hesitated, her eyes darting to the chair, then back to Mel, as though calculating whether this was a trap or an act of kindness. Finally, she shuffled forward and perched on the edge of the seat, ready to bolt at a moment's notice. "Look," he started, his tone softening, "I'm not some preacher or anything, but to me, Jesus, he's someone who doesn't give up on you, no matter how messed up life gets. He's about forgiveness, about starting over, even when you think it's too late." The girl looked down, tracing invisible lines on the table with her finger. "Starting over, huh?" she muttered, almost to herself. Mel leaned forward slightly. "Yeah, starting over. You ever feel like you need that?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at her hands, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly, "but I don't think it works for people like me." Mel didn't let her words hang in the air for long. His response was immediate, his voice steady and unwavering. "Why not?" he asked, his question cutting through her doubt like a beacon in the dark. The girl shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I've done bad things, stuff I'm not proud of, and people don't really look at someone like me and think I deserve a fresh start." Mel let her words sink in, his expression soft but serious. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping gently on the edge of the table. "You know," he began, his tone quiet but firm, "I used to think like that too." Her eyes darted up to meet his. There was surprise there, maybe even disbelief. "You?" she asked, almost incredulously. "Yeah, me," he said with a small, humorless chuckle. "I've made mistakes. Big ones. Hurt people I cared about. There were times I thought I'd never climb out of the hole I dug for myself. But I realized something. It's not about deserving it. Nobody deserves grace. That's what makes it grace." The girl frowned slightly, as if the concept was just out of reach. "So you just got forgiven? Just like that?" "It wasn't that simple," Mel admitted. "It took time. A lot of time. And a lot of hard work. I had to face things about myself that I didn't want to see. I had to ask for forgiveness, not just from God, but from the people I hurt. And let me tell you," he leaned forward, his voice lowering, "it wasn't easy, but it was worth it." The girl looked at him intently now, her earlier skepticism melting away. "What made you want to change?" Mel paused, his eyes drifting toward the horizon as if searching for the right words. "I hit rock bottom," he said finally. "And when you're at the bottom, there's only one way to go, up. But you can't do it alone. That's what I had to learn." She nodded slowly, not because she fully understood, but because she was starting to. There was a weight to his words that felt real, unpolished and raw. But before she could respond, a soft commotion broke the moment. A few strangers had stopped nearby, their curious eyes flickering between Mel and the girl, drawn by the unexpected intimacy of the exchange. The girl glanced over her shoulder at the small group forming nearby. A man in a gray suit, a couple holding hands, and an older woman carrying groceries. All of them slowed their steps, subtly lingering to catch bits of the conversation. Mel noticed too, but didn't seem to mind. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his focus unwavering. "You see," he continued, as if speaking only to the girl, "sometimes when you think no one's watching, that's when life surprises you. People notice things. They notice moments like this." The girl looked skeptical. "They're just being nosy," she muttered, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Maybe," Mel replied, shrugging lightly. "Or maybe they're looking for something, just like you are. Hope. Meaning. A reason to believe things can get better." The girl stared at him, her expression softening just a little. "Do you really think things can get better? For anyone?" "I don't think," Mel said firmly. "I know." A woman from the small crowd, her curiosity getting the better of her, stepped closer. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, clutching her grocery bag. "Are you talking about faith?" Mel turned to her, offering a polite nod. "We are," he said, his tone even. "And how it can help you climb out of some pretty deep holes." The woman smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "I needed to hear that today," she whispered, almost to herself. The girl watched the interaction, her posture relaxing just a bit. It was as if the presence of others somehow validated her own doubts and questions. She leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter now. "So what if you don't know where to start? What do you do?" Mel met her gaze, his voice calm and steady. "You start where you are, with what you have. Even if it's just a question. That's enough." But the girl didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, as if weighing whether to believe him or retreat back into the shell she'd built to survive. Her fingers stilled on the table, her eyes flickering with something unspoken. Finally, she asked, "Have you ever been so lost you couldn't even see the way out? Like it's not even there?" Mel's expression shifted, a shadow of pain crossing his face. He nodded slowly, the weight of her question settling over him. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I've been there. There were nights when I felt like I'd never find my way back. Like no one would care if I didn't. The girl swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to her lap. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "That's how I feel. All the time." For a moment, the noise of the street seemed to fade, the world narrowing to just the two of them. Mel leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "You're wrong," he said. "You may not see it now, but there are people who care. And even if it's just one person, sometimes that's enough to pull you back." Her gaze lifted, meeting his. There was a vulnerability there now, a crack in the armor she had worn for so long. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mel hesitated, his hand brushing the edge of his coffee cup. "Because I've lived it," he said. "There was a time when I thought I'd lost everything. My career, my family, my dignity. But someone believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And that's what saved me." The girl's brow furrowed, her mind racing to process his words. "Who was it?" she asked. Mel smiled faintly. "A friend," he said simply. "Someone who didn't give up on me, even when I gave up on myself." The girl's lips parted as if to speak, but before she could, one of the onlookers chimed in. "Sounds like you've been through a lot," the man in the gray suit said, his tone a mix of curiosity and respect. Mel nodded, glancing at the growing crowd. "We all go through a lot," he replied. "But it's not about what happens to us. It's about how we choose to respond. You can let it break you, or you can let it build you." But as the words left his mouth, the girl's eyes filled with tears. Her walls crumbled in a way that seemed both terrifying and freeing. The tears slid silently down her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away with the sleeve of her oversized hoodie. Her voice cracked as she spoke, barely above a whisper. "What if you're too broken to fix? What if it's just too late?" Mel's eyes softened, his tone steady but filled with conviction. "It's never too late," he said. "Not for you. Not for anyone. The cracks, the breaks, they're just part of your story. They don't define you. What defines you is what you do next." The girl shook her head, her fingers tightening around the frayed strap of her backpack. "You don't know what it's like," she said, her voice trembling. "Being invisible. Like you don't matter. Like no one sees you." Mel leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I see you," he said. "And you matter. You matter more than you know." The girl's breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might bolt. But something about his words, or maybe the way he said them, kept her rooted to the chair. She looked down at her hands, her voice shaking as she asked, "What do I do? How do I start?" Mel reached into his pocket, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here," he said. "They can help you get back on your feet. It's not easy, but it's a start. And if you ever need someone to talk to," he scribbled something on the back of the paper, a phone number. "You call me, okay?" She stared at the paper, her fingers hesitating before picking it up. "You'd really help me?" she asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "Absolutely," Mel said without hesitation. "Because someone helped me when I needed it. And now it's my turn to do the same." The girl's lips quivered as she clutched the paper tightly. For the first time, there was a spark of hope in her eyes, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she thought. But before she could say anything more, a voice from the crowd interrupted, breaking the moment but not the impact of what had just unfolded. A middle-aged man from the crowd stepped forward, his expression a mix of awe and emotion. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, addressing Mel but glancing at the girl. "It's inspiring." Mel looked up at the man, a hint of a smile on his face. "It's not about inspiration," he said simply. "It's about doing what's right. Sometimes people just need someone to remind them they're not alone." The man nodded, clearly moved, and took a step back, blending back into the small gathering. The girl, still clutching the paper, glanced at the crowd for the first time. She didn't seem afraid of their attention. Instead, she straightened slightly in her seat, as if realizing she wasn't invisible anymore. She turned back to Mel, her voice softer but steadier now. "Thank you," she said, the words simple but heartfelt. "For seeing me. For everything." Mel nodded. "You've got this," he said. "One step at a time. Just don't give up, no matter how hard it gets." She stood slowly, her movements uncertain but deliberate. The crowd parted as she walked away, her bare feet moving purposefully down the sidewalk. Several people watched her go, their faces reflecting the weight of what they had witnessed. Mel sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He picked up his coffee again, but it had gone cold. Not that it mattered. He wasn't thinking about the coffee. His mind was on the girl and the question she had asked, a question that had peeled back layers of his own life he hadn't planned to revisit. But just as he thought the moment was over, an older woman from the crowd leaned in, her eyes glistening with emotion. "That was beautiful," she said quietly. "I think you gave all of us something to think about." Mel offered the older woman a small, appreciative nod, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said, "the smallest moments can make the biggest difference." That girl reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, how powerful a question can be. The woman smiled gently, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "It's rare to see someone take the time to listen like you did. She'll remember this forever." As the crowd began to disperse, Mel sat quietly for a moment, watching the girl's figure grow smaller in the distance. The paper he had given her seemed like such a small thing, but he knew it could mean the world to someone who needed it. He hoped she would hold on to it, not just the address or the number, but the belief that someone out there cared. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the cafe patio. Mel finally stood, leaving a generous tip on the table before heading toward his car. His heart felt lighter, though he couldn't fully explain why. Perhaps it was the girl's courage to ask the question, or the way the crowd had been moved, or maybe it was the simple reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always a glimmer of light. As he opened his car door, he glanced back one last time, his mind replaying her words. "What if you're too broken to fix?" He shook his head softly. No one is ever too broken to find their way back. That's the beauty of grace. To the viewers watching this story, take a moment to reflect. You never know what someone is going through, and sometimes the smallest gesture, a kind word, a listening ear, or just showing someone they're not invisible, can change their life. Be that light for someone. And if this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more stories that remind us of the power of kindness, faith, and human connection. Because in the end, it's these moments that bring us closer to understanding what really matters.